Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and a bit of a different look today. I'm having to try a few new things. I've had to raise my desk into a standing desk for a little while, so I'm going to record like this. Hopefully you don't mind the look of it, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. And today the product that we're taking a look at is the Linear Tube Audio Micro zOTL 3 amp, or the MZ3. I'll explain what all that means, micro zOTL, all that sort of stuff. I'll talk about that shortly. But I want to start off by saying that the reason this review came to pass was because a couple of patrons heard the MZ3 at various audio shows. One of them in particular loved it so much that he bought the unit that was there on the floor. And so after hearing about how much they enjoyed it, I was really keen to get my hands on one. And I want to say a huge thanks to Linear Tube Audio for sending me the MZ3 on loan. It's going to move on from here afterwards unless I decide to buy it, which I might. I haven't quite worked that out yet. And so in the short term, I want to say a huge thanks to Linear Tube Audio for sending this one out on loan for the review. The MZ3 is a $3,700 amp, making it a fairly expensive headphone amplifier. It's also a preamp and a speaker amp if you've got sensitive speakers, and it uses some pretty unique technology. Before I dive deep into that technology though, let's take a closer look at the MZ3. Just to finish off getting acquainted with the unit, let's do a quick tour before I start talking about the technologies inside. And along the way for the tour, I will talk about some of the features now. And so as we look at the front of the device here, we've got a power button on the far side, and next to that is an input button. There's 3 different inputs on this amp, which is fantastic. So you can run 3 different DACs if you like, or of course a turntable and 2 DACs, whatever digital and analog sources you like. You've got 3 RCA inputs, as you'll see on the back shortly. We've then got a volume control here. That's connected to a stepped attenuator, so it's a very precise volume control. We've then got this kind of dot matrix style display, which I really like. It's incredibly bright. It gives you multiple different steps up to 16 different levels of brightness, but honestly anything above about level 1 is almost too bright. At level 16 it's competing with the sun, so it's a really bright display should you need it, but generally I think it's bright enough at levels sort of 1 to 3. Next to the display we've got the headphone output or the speaker preamplifier output switch, and then finally we've got a 6.3mm headphone output. Now one thing that you probably can't see in the video here, and I tried to clean up for the B-roll, but one thing I've noticed with the finish of the MZ3 is that it's got this sort of soft touch matte kind of finish in black paint, but it's got a slight roughness to it that means that when you are touching it to do things like pull out a 6.3mm connector, it does tend to capture a little bit of kind of scraped off dead skin. I know that sounds a bit gross, but that's what it is. And so you do tend to leave sort of white smudges on the surface. It's not a reason, in my opinion, not to buy an amplifier like this, but for the absolute clean freaks out there, it might be something that drives you a bit nuts, and you might find yourself constantly kind of wanting to wipe the surface away. So do be aware of that one if it's something that's going to bother you. As I said, it doesn't really worry me. It's not a big deal. The amplifier feels nice to interact with, so it's not like it feels harsh or rough, but it has got just enough roughness in the finish that it will capture a bit of that kind of white smudge when you do touch the amplifier. Moving around to the back of the amp, and look at the back of the amplifier. What we've got starting over here are your speaker terminals. I mentioned before this is a speaker amp, but it is designed for particularly sensitive speakers. So it's only going to put out about a watt into a 4 ohm load, which is not particularly strong, but it is going to be enough to drive some sensitive speakers, particularly in a near field type setup where you don't need a lot of volume, you're not sitting a long way away from them. But for the purpose of this review, I'm not going to talk about it as a speaker amp. I don't have any appropriate speakers here. I use all active speakers. So it's more something that I'm flagging that it can do it, but you will need to look elsewhere if you want to know how it performs as a speaker amp. The good news is if it's able to power the speakers, what you should hear is similar to what I'm going to describe when using it as a preamp and as a headphone amp, and that's fantastic, as we'll get to shortly. Before we get to all that though, let's take a look at the rest of the amplifier. On the back here, we've got a pair of preamp outputs. So you can run this to 2 different amplifiers. You might want to use it to run an external headphone amp, a power amplifier. Maybe you've got a pair of active speakers as well. So you've got 2 different outputs that both will run all the time. So you can't switch between them, but there's 2 different outputs there should you want it. What we've also got, and I've already talked about this, is 3 different RCA inputs that are switchable, of course. So you've got 3 different options of things like turntables, streamers, a separate DAC, all those sorts of things you can run into this one with 3 different options that are switchable both by a switch on the front, but also a remote control, which I hadn't mentioned yet. Linear Tube Audio have chosen to use the Apple remote control for controlling the MZ3, and that could potentially cause some issues if you're using one of these for other devices in your room. But for most people, it just means you're getting a nice quality remote control that gives you full access to all the different menu options. And within that menu, you've got things like the gain control. You can choose between having a 100 step or a 199 step volume control. You can, of course, choose the inputs, the brightness of the display. You can change the balance. There's lots of versatility. This is by no means a simple dumb tube amp. There's actually a lot of technology going on within the MZ3 that kind of belies its nature as an OTL tube amp. And speaking of that, the other thing we should talk about before I get onto the sound quality and also start talking about some of the usability of this, one of the other things I should mention is that if you look at the top of the amplifier, you've got a pair of tubes sticking out and a pair of tubes that you don't quite stick out, but you can see through the top there. And what we've got there is a pair of 12 AT7s in the inside there, the smaller tubes, and a set of 12 SN7s in the larger sockets there. Now, the good news is you can roll these a little bit, so you could use 12 AU7s if you wanted less gain, although I don't think there's any need to because this is not hugely powerful. And you can also change it for 6 SN7s in the power tube slots because there's a switch inside that lets you change between having a 6 volt and a 12 volt heater supply. And that's the only difference between the 6 SN7s and the 12 SN7s is how much voltage they require for the heater element. And so just to reiterate, this is a pure tube amplifier, but it's quite a high-tech one. I've just plugged it in and powered it up so you can see it in action, you can see the display, and by the way, this display is only on level 1 brightness. You can already see how bright that it is. When you switch it on, it goes through its little warm-up routine to allow the tubes to heat up, and then after that, as I said before, it's quite an intelligent and high-tech tube amp. You've got the volume always displayed on screen, but it will also tell you things like which input you change to, and then as I said before, it's got a stepped volume control, so when you do change the volume, you're going to hear it clicking through the different steps. Some people love that, some people not so much. I don't mind either way. But now is probably a really good time to start talking about some of the technologies that are built in to the MZ3. And there's quite a lot to talk about, so bear with me as we step through some of the details. Or of course, if you don't care about this stuff, you can use the chapter markers to skip straight to how it sounds. Probably the most important thing to talk about when we're talking about the MZ3 is the fact that it's a zOTL amplifier. And what that means is it's an output transformerless amplifier, but not in the way that things like a Dark Voice, a Bottlehead Crack, an X-Duo TA26, not in the way that some of those are. And that's because the zOTL technology is a very specific technology that's patented, it's been licensed to Linear Tube Audio, and what it's doing is it's allowing the amplifier to run without output transformers, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. It's allowing it to run without output transformers, but while still allowing a low output impedance. So in most OTL or output transformerless amps, what's happening is you're essentially connecting the output directly to the tubes, and in most cases there'll be capacitors in between, but there's no output transformer, which is basically when they take a big iron core, wrap a whole lot of wire around it, and pass the signal through that to better match the impedance of the tubes with the impedance of the headphones. In the case of the zOTL technology, what's being done is a bit different in 2 ways. Firstly, what's happening is that the actual signal is being carried on what they call a carrier signal. So with a normal tube amp, with a normal OTL amp, what's happening is the exact musical signal is going into the tube, being amplified by the tube, spitting out the other end, and going straight to your headphones, normally via a capacitor. In the case of the zOTL, what's happening is that, and I don't understand the full details of this one, I haven't been able to dig deep enough to get the full answers in a way that I can explain it, but what's basically happening is that that signal is being attached to a carrier signal, which as I understand it is a much more high frequency signal, and so what's then happening is that high frequency signal, which is a little bit like using a radio wave to carry music to your radio, although of course here it's all traveling through wires, there's no transmission through air going on here. But what's happening is that the music signal is being attached to the carrier signal is then being amplified by the tubes within the circuit, and then the carrier signal is then being extracted back out and leaving you with your music signal. And the reason they're doing it is it allows then for an impedance transformation process to go on. And there's multiple little copper coils that you'll see in the B-roll for this amp. And those little copper coils are helping to extract the musical signal from the carrier signal and transfer them to the headphone at a much lower impedance. Now, if you want to dive deeper into the technology of this, there are some articles on the Linear Tube Audio website. I'll link through to that website here so you can go take a look. But what we really need to know from a listening point of view is that the signal is going through the amplifier in such a way that it's coming out with just a 2 ohm output impedance. And what that means is that the MZ3 gives us the ability to enjoy OTL sound on any headphone you like, even on IEMs in most cases. There is a very, very minor hiss through IEMs, and I'm not recommending it as an IEM amplifier, but the point is that it's actually suitable for really anything from about 16 ohms upwards in terms of your headphone impedance. A couple of other things to talk about in terms of the amplification design is that it uses a push-pull Class A circuit for those that care about that sort of thing. And it also uses zero feedback. So feedback is a thing where some amplifiers actually take the signal and feed it back on itself to help pull out distortion. But there's a common school of thought that having less feedback results in a more natural sound. I know the Bottlehead amplifiers that I've written up reviews on Headfire about and also reviewed here on the channel in the case of the Mainline, they go for a zero feedback design and I've always enjoyed the results. So I do think it's a good thing and I do think it plays out in just how good the MZ3 sounds. The other thing to talk about in terms of the amplification design is the power output. I already said that it's going to give you about 1 watt into 4 ohms. But what that means is it's not a very powerful amplifier for your headphones either. It'll give you about 125 milliwatts into a 32 ohm load, and that may sound tiny. We're used to seeing in the headphone world amplifiers with 1.2 or 1.4 watts into 32 ohms, and that's often coming from a $100 or $200 amp. So to spend $3,000 plus US dollars and only get 125 milliwatts into 30 odd ohms, that may seem like a bit of a rip-off. But keep in mind that that will actually drive almost all headphones on the market. The most difficult headphone I have here at the moment is something like an HE400 SE, which is a low-end headphone. I wouldn't recommend it as a pairing with this in terms of price versus performance. But to put it into perspective, the HE400 SE, which is slightly difficult to drive, that will still reach 110 decibels of sound, which is dangerous, at just 80 milliwatts of input. So with 125 milliwatts of power here, there is actually more than enough for most headphones. And to put that into context, I'm going to scroll up the screen here now, a bunch of different headphones that I tried, and the volume level in the 0 decibel gain mode, which is technically the top gain mode from this amp. In the 0 decibel gain mode, this was the headphones that I tried that worked really well with the MZ3 and the volume at which I tried them. And what you'll see is that for most headphones, it's sitting at around about the 40 to 45 out of 99 volume range. So plenty of room to spare, which means you're not operating the amplifier anywhere near its limits, and you can enjoy great sound across pretty much any headphone on the market. Obviously there's no Susvaras, no Abyss 1266s going on here, but basically any headphone with sensitivity that's around that sort of 93, 94, 95 decibels per milliwatt of sound or above is going to work just fine from the MZ3. And I've just realized there was something I didn't talk about before when I was giving you the tour of the headphone amp, and that is that there's a funny plug on the back which is actually a 5-pin XLR, and I didn't mention that that's actually there to connect to the external linear power supply. So the amplifier itself that I've got here is actually fairly lightweight. It's very easy to place on your desk and move around because the big transformer is housed externally from the actual amplifier. And so you get the umbilical cord coming out the back of the amplifier, which goes off and plugs into the external power supply. For some people that's a hassle because it means an extra box. For other people it makes things easier. I'll leave it up to you to decide. In terms of the size of the box, the actual power supply is a little bit smaller than the size of the amplifier itself. It's a very similar looking box. It's just got a power switch on the front. And so it does mean that you can't actually stack the two together because the power supply is smaller and you've got tubes sticking out the top here. So this one has to go on top. But it's very easy to place the power supply under your desk, for instance, and then have just the amplifier on your desk. So apologies that I missed that one before. This does have a power supply. It is external and it is a linear power supply. Now I think at this point I've told you everything that you need to know with one little exception. And this is an exception that I can't actually test for you. I can only report what's being said by Linear Tube Audio. And that is that the way they're running these tubes apparently is going to actually extend the life of the tubes as well. So by running this carrier signal through the tubes and not having them directly connected to the headphones or to a transformer, apparently what that does is it means that they're not pushing the tubes as hard and the tube should have an extended lifespan as a result. So for those of you that are a big fan of tubes but worry about lifespan of tubes, this could be a great amp for you, assuming you like what I have to say about how it sounds. And then while we're talking tubes, the final thing I should mention is that the amplifier comes with carefully selected tubes. Because they are tubes, and I believe they're NOS tubes, meaning they're new old stock, you might get different tubes with different amplifiers, but they will have been carefully selected by Linear Tube Audio. That does though mean that there could be very slight variations between what you hear and what I hear, because there could be subtle variations between which tubes are available. It doesn't mean you're going to get a completely different amp, because no doubt they're being chosen to match the voicing of the amp that Linear Tube Audio want, but there could be ever so slight variations, so do keep that in mind as well. But for now, let's talk about how the MZ3 sounds. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. And the way I started testing this was I connected up the MZ3 to the Chord Hugo TT2, so I was running the TT2 as a DAC into the MZ3, and then I was also running the headphones out of the TT2 directly. And so the idea there was I wanted to hear what sort of character the MZ3 was adding over and above what I heard direct from the front of the TT2. The sound from the MZ3 is a little bit fuller, a little bit richer in some ways than what was coming out of the TT2, but it's not an overly thick sounding amp either. It definitely has a sense of the tube character and sound, but what impressed me about the MZ3 was that it still had plenty of detail and resolution. Not quite as much as the direct output from the TT2, but very, very close. And so it's an amplifier that I can see people enjoying if you want that sort of tube sound, but you still want resolution and detail and texture to be almost as good as it can be from a top tier solid state. Listening to a track like Through and Through by the Rolling Stones, and it becomes really clear that the MZ3 is bringing a little bit of extra mid-range focus, a bit of mid-range kind of emphasis, if you like, without pushing everything too far forward, but there's definitely a sense of kind of mid-range quality to the MZ3 that's different from what you get from the TT2. As I said before, it is a little bit richer and a little bit fuller, but it's not at all a thick sound. Something else I noticed was that there is a tiny sense of lost clarity from the MZ3 compared to the TT2, but that's not really dissimilar from any external headphone amp. Because it's such a short signal path within the TT2 going from the DAC to the headphone stage, anytime you're using an external amplifier where you're going out the RCA sockets, through the interconnects, into another set of RCAs, through an external amplifier circuit, and then out to the headphones, you're almost always going to lose a little bit. And the MZ3 is only a fractional loss. It's not a big drop at all. It's probably not quite as transparent as something like the Burson Soloist 3X GT, which is a solid state amp, but it's right there behind it, and that's great for an OTL tube amp. Another thing I noticed as I listened to Through and Through was that the bass from the MZ3 isn't quite as tight as it is from the TT2, but that very slightly looser bass gives you a tiny bit more punch. And so it's going to depend on what you want. If you want snappy tight bass, then you might want to stick with solid state. But if you like that little bit of extra punch that a slightly looser bass presentation brings, then the MZ3 is great. And by no means is it loose. It's not flabby, woolly, boomy, any of those terms that you might throw around. It's still tight. It's just not as tight as the TT2, and that makes it a tiny bit punchier. At around the 350 mark in Through and Through, there's a guitar solo, or some guitar licks, I should say. And what was really interesting when I went between the TT2 and the MZ3 at that sort of 3-minute 50 mark, what I heard was that the MZ3 somehow pulled the guitar out of the mix more. I could really focus in on it. I could hear it more distinctly. On the TT2, it's obviously still there, but there's something about the character of the tubes and the design of the MZ3 that just brings out that sort of mid-range quality and helps you focus in on things like vocals, guitars, any of those instrumentations that are front and center and within that mid-range band. So it's really enjoyable. Whether it's right, whether it's wrong, accurate, not accurate, I'm not going to try and debate that. The point is it's fun to listen to for the MZ3. It might be a little bit colored, but it's a really positive coloring in my opinion. What that also translates to is that overall, the image separation, so the way the sound is pulled apart, is in some ways stronger from the MZ3. It's not necessarily again to say that it's a better technical amplifier than what's coming out of the TT2 headphone socket, But what it's doing is the character it's bringing to the sound helps to separate things out, helps to give everything a really clear sense of place in the mix, and it could be because of a slight loss of texture from the MZ3, not kind of getting in the way of the spatial cues. It's one of those things where it's almost like a bit of, not noise because it's meant to be in the music, but that textual information is acting like noise to kind of blur the edges of each individual sound, whereas with the MZ3, that bit of texture is taken away, and so each individual instrument kind of pops out of its place in space just a little bit more. We're talking very small incremental differences, but they're definitely there, and I really enjoy the character the MZ3 brings. But for me, one of the biggest questions when I'm reviewing an amplifier like this, being a tube amp, is how does it compare to other tube amps? And I'm fortunate enough to have 3 great tube amps here on my desk in regular rotation in the Bottlehead Mainline, also the Elekit TU-8200R, and then finally the Schiit Folkvangr. And so I tried out each of those 3 tube amps to see how each one compared to what I was hearing from the MZ3. And it was really interesting because both the TT2 and the Elekit TU-8200R, both of those are transformer coupled amps, meaning that the tube does its thing and then the sound goes through a transformer, round and round all those wrappings of wire, and then spits out to your headphones. So that's the more traditional way of getting a lower output impedance, allowing it to work well with lower impedance dynamic headphones, for instance. And in both cases, there are positive characters to the mainline and the Elekit TU-8200R that are different to and not necessarily better or worse than the MZ3. So let me talk briefly about what I heard from both of those amps in comparison to the output transformerless MZ3 here. When comparing to the mainline, what I heard was that the MZ3 is a little bit more euphonic. And what I mean by that is it's got a bit of extra kind of warmth, a bit of romanticism to the sound. It's just got a little bit of something that it adds to the music. Whereas the mainline actually sounds quite solid state. It's a very clean, somewhat dry sounding tube amp, which is great if you want a tube amp that's not overly coloured. But if you're actually looking for a bit of that tube character, the MZ3 is bringing that a bit more. Now, some of this I should add is down to the capacitors that I've put into the mainline. It's probably actually in a state at the moment that's a little bit drier than I would like, and I might try some new capacitors in the future. But in its current format, the mainline is actually quite a dry sounding tube amp, whereas the MZ3 just tilts in the other direction. Neither of them are a vast step away from being kind of neutral and honest. But in the case of the MZ3, it's adding just a dash of romanticism, euphony, whatever word you want to use, whereas the TT2 is probably only a half step in that direction. It's very close to the neutral mark, and therefore it's quite a dry, kind of neutral sound. The MZ3 produces a fuller bass than the mainline, and that's really saying something because the mainline, one of its strengths for me has always been its bass reproduction. It doesn't sound like a tube amp bass that traditionally tends to roll off. It's always impressed me with its ability to deliver bass that extends deep and stays present and full. And the MZ3 does that and then some. It's not to say that the MZ3 is suddenly a bassy or bass-oriented amplifier, but it's holding its own with the TT2 and that very slightly kind of looser bass that I talked about before, and we're talking really, really slight. But that very slight amount of bass looseness, or even freedom you could call it, is allowing the MZ3 just to have a little bit more body in the bass. Listening to Sit Around and Miss You by the Black Keys, I felt like the mainline was just ever so slightly more detailed. It was extracting just a tiny bit more resolution from the music when compared to the MZ3, but at the same time it was coming across that little bit drier as I talked about before, and the MZ3 just comes across so easy to listen to, and that was really the difference point for me. The MZ3 does have that touch of euphony, that touch of romanticism. It's got a little bit of tubiness, for want of a better word. But what that also means is it's very easy. The music just flows out of the MZ3 and it's very easy to engage with and enjoy, and that's definitely one of the strengths of it for me. Moving over then to the TU-8200R, and what I heard from that was a more articulate, more clear sound again compared to the MZ3, and I can't stress enough that the MZ3 is not a soft, woolly amp, but these transformer coupled amps are just giving you a slightly greater sense of attack on the leading edges of notes, and that could be artificial attack, that could be something created by the qualities and the properties, both good and bad, of transformers. But the end result is a slightly greater sense of clarity from the 8200R, and just for reference, I was running a pair of KT88s in it at the time. These are quite a dynamic and energetic sounding tube, so that's also going to add to the sound quality, is the tubes in here compared to the tubes in the 8200R. They've got their own character as well. But I do think the 8200R overall is just a slightly more kind of focused and not aggressive, but a slightly more kind of articulated sound. It's going to give you a bit more energy at the leading edge of notes, but that's not necessarily a good thing, because one of the things that sets the MZ3 apart again in this comparison is the ease with which it delivers the sound. One of the tracks I listened to was Gumshoe by Corey Wong, and there's a sax solo in this, and the sax solo just kind of oozes and flows out of the MZ3. And I mean that in a sense that it was just so easy to take in and so easy to enjoy, whereas I felt like from the 8200R, I was reminded I was listening to a good recording through a really good amp. With the MZ3, it was more like a live performance. The ease with which it was delivered, the naturality with which it was delivered was all, for me at least, in favour to the MZ3. Once again, I think the bass was probably a bit tighter from something like the 8200R, and it was probably a touch punchier as well, which could be down to the tubes. So the 8200R probably did have the edge a little bit on bass control and bass energy. I feel like the MZ3 had the edge on things like that mid-range warmth and that mid-range focus, but it also came across a little bit more intimate. And by intimate, I mean everything felt a bit closer to me. And so the 8200R was delivering a little bit more attack, a little bit more sense of clarity. I think the imaging focus was maybe a touch better from the 8200R. But I just couldn't get past the sense of naturalness, the sense of ease, the sense that I was actually listening to the music, not a recording. That's what the MZ3 brought. And so I'm not for a second sitting here and saying that the MZ3 is better clearly and definitively than the Mainline or the 8200R. I think all three are great amps and each has their own strengths. And where that leaves us for the MZ3 is that it is giving you that wonderful sense of fluidity and transparency, not transparency in terms of detail retrieval, but transparency in terms of not getting in the way of anything, giving you that access to what sounds like a live rendition rather than a great reproduction of a recording. That's where the MZ3 is really shining. But that's also where it started me thinking maybe what I'm hearing here is not that far different from something like the Schiit Folkvangr, because the Schiit Folkvangr is also an OTL amp. It's not a zOTL, so it's not using that whole carrier frequency thing that I spoke about before. It's a true traditional OTL amp, and it's also an output capacitorless amp. So in the case of an OTL, or I believe in a zOTL like this one, there will be capacitors between the tubes and your output, being your headphones in this case. Whereas in the Folkvangr, those capacitors are also gone. So I was curious to see, one of the things I loved about the Folkvangr when I reviewed it was just how transparent and fluid it seemed, and I was interested to know if it was actually on the same level as the MZ3, or maybe they were a bit different. Listening to Baby I'm a Fool by Melody Gardot and jumping between the MZ3 and the Folkvangr, what I found was that the MZ3 is quite similar to the Folkvangr, but it's more controlled. It's got a greater sense of texture and resolution because it just feels like it's doing everything with a bit more technicality perhaps. On the other hand though, the Folkvangr has a sense of immediacy and presence to it. It's got a sense of meat in the presentation, again not because it's overly thick and rich, although it is a bit richer and thicker than the MZ3, but it's just got a sense of presence and weight to its sound that's really enjoyable. I don't think it's maybe as technically as strong as the MZ3, but it's definitely got a reason to exist and it's got its own charms, its own pros. The Folkvangr brings things like the vocals closer still, so I said before that the MZ3 is a bit more intimate than something like the 8200R, and I felt like the Folkvangr did another step again. It doesn't get claustrophobic by any sense, but it's not quite as spacious as the MZ3. As part of that, I felt like the MZ3 also did a better job at separating out sounds. So things like the vocals, the guitars, the snare, the cymbals, all of them were better separated in the MZ3. The Folkvangr, it did start to blend together a little bit. It wasn't muddy or messy, but it wasn't as well delineated as the MZ3 could do. Jumping back and forth between the two, the Folkvangr is definitely the thicker and creamier sound, for better or worse. It's not a neutral amplifier, the Folkvangr. I talked about that in the Folkvangr review. It's unashamedly a warmer sounding amp, and in that sense, it's clearly warmer than the MZ3. Now, I think I said before when I was talking about how the Folkvangr was a bit immediate and present, I said not because it's warm. What I was getting at there, in case it sounds like I've contradicted myself, what I was getting at there was that the immediacy and the presence of the sound is not because it is warm, it's because of the character of the way the sound is being delivered from the output transformerless and output capacitorless design of the Folkvangr. It does also happen to be a bit warm and a bit thick, but the immediacy and the presence is not coming from that, I don't think. It just has a really kind of direct connection to the music that's a little bit different from the MZ3, but both share similarities there. And indeed, as I got to the end of making my notes, one of the things that I wrote down was that I don't know that I could choose whether I preferred the Folkvangr or the MZ3. They're different, but they're on the same continuum and both have their strengths. And specifically what I like about both of them, and this is probably true for most OTL amps, whether it's a zOTL like this one here, or whether it's more of a traditional OTL amp, what I love is the fact that by getting the transformer out of the way, you're getting this really natural connection to the sound. The music flows out of both amps in a very organic way, and I absolutely love both amps for it. If you were looking for the most technical, most kind of probably accurate sound between the two, then I do think the MZ3 is the one to choose. I think the Folkvangr goes further into coloration, it goes further into euphony and creaminess and all those other terms I've used. And so the MZ3 is retaining a more natural and neutral sound that's got some coloration, it's got some tube character, but it's not going as far down that path as the Folkvangr. And so where that brings us at the end of this is that I think the MZ3 is a brilliant amplifier. I think it's an amplifier that you have to go into buying with a knowledge of exactly what you're getting. And specifically what I mean by that is you're not getting much power. If you're looking for a headphone amp that is going to drive very difficult headphones like Susvaras or Abyss 1266s, then you absolutely should look elsewhere. But if you're running any other headphone on the planet pretty much, this is going to be completely fine. Don't get persuaded by people that tell you that you need bucket loads of power just because your headphone happens to be a planar magnetic. Some of the best pairings I've had with the MZ3 are things like the HE1000, the HE1000 SE, and the Meza Elites, all three being planar magnetics. It also happens to pair spectacularly well with the Verite Open from ZMF. And so there's plenty of great options that you can pair with this, and indeed, as I said before, it's pretty much any headphone on the planet is going to work fine with it. When we start talking about synergies, some of that just comes down to personal preference. I often get asked in reviews to talk about which headphones go well with which amplifiers, but it's such a difficult thing to answer because it depends on your tastes. You might like a leaner sound, in which case with a headphone amplifier like this one, you'd want to start with a pretty lean headphone and allow it to get warmed up a little bit by the MZ3. On the other hand, you might like your sound to be rich and full and kind of lush. If that's the case, then you'd want to start with a slightly richer, warmer headphone and then pair it with the MZ3. So synergy is still a part of preference, and I can't answer that for everybody. What I can tell you though is there wasn't a headphone I tried this with that it didn't work well with. But my personal favourite was probably the Verite Opens. It just worked really well with their speed and their general tuning. It was a lovely, lovely match. And so if you're in the market for a headphone amp, I think the MZ3 is a great choice, so long as you're happy to give up a little bit of the resolution that you might expect from a top tier solid state amp. And I mean top tier, we're talking this is just a hair behind in terms of resolution. It's a hair behind things like the Soloist GT, the Benchmark HPA4, the Sparkos Labs Aries. It's a truly top tier amplifier, but it's not going to hit the levels of something like those amps, those solid state amps that I just mentioned. So keep that in mind if you're looking for an amplifier. This does bring a little bit less texture, but at the same time gives you that euphony, that natural kind of organic delivery that some of those solid state amps can't match in quite the same way. It is a little bit coloured, it's not completely neutral, but that's really the joy of it. And so where I'd recommend the MZ3 and how I would sum it up to you is that if you're looking for a tube amp, if you want a very pure, very natural connection to the music with a dash of tubey flavour and character, the MZ3 is an absolutely brilliant choice. The fact that it's also a brilliant preamp, and I should say everything I've described for headphones is true for it when being used as a preamp. The fact that that is true as well, and the fact that you can also drive sensitive speakers with it, just make this an absolute winner of a product. I said before that I'm not sure if I want to buy this one direct from LTA when I finish reviewing it, and the reason I said that before is that, as I mentioned, I've already got the Folkvangr, I've already got the 8200R and the Mainline. It's not a reflection of how good this is, I think it's brilliant. If I had the cash and I had the need, I would snap this up in a moment. And one thing that I particularly love, and this is sort of my finishing comments now, one thing I particularly love is the combination of the natural tubey connection to the music mixed with the fantastic sort of smart features that it's got. Having balance control, having gain control, having the stepped attenuator and a remote control for that matter, all of that is absolutely priceless in my opinion when paired with such a wonderfully transparent tube stage. And so if that sounds like your cup of tea, I'll put a link down below through to the Linear Tube Audio website. I want to say a huge thanks once again to Paisley Underground, that was the patron that really drew my attention to this one. And also, of course, to Linear Tube Audio for making this review possible. So thank you to Nicholas and the team at Linear Tube Audio. Thank you to Paisley Underground and the other patrons that recommended that I try this one. And thank you to you for watching it. I hope you've enjoyed it, found it useful. Hopefully I've introduced you to a new option that you might consider in your future audio journey. And if you have found the video useful or helpful or just interesting, I'd love it as always if you hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.